And so you have to be willing to invite discomfort into your life in order to love your neighbor, in order to care for the unborn. You can't care for the unborn and also pursue the idols of comfort and ease and materialism.
Anthony Bradley, thanks for sitting down with me.
Thanks for having me.
So you are a professor, well, you've been a professor, you're an author of 13 books.
Yeah, more or less, right.
I think one a year is what you do, which is kind of crazy. And then you're a writer and researcher, speaker and researcher. You just gave a great presentation yesterday about fatherlessness, which I definitely want to talk to you about. You've done a lot of work on racism. I want to talk about that. And then recent work on incarceration. So there's a lot of great stuff to talk about here. But let's get started with why you're pro-life and really your background. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I was raised in a Black community in Atlanta. And I often say I didn't really become pro-life. I just was always pro-life. I guess for me, it was always a question of why would someone want to end the life of their baby? And I was raised in a community where people just had kids and they were strong marriages and things like that. So when I got introduced to the idea that people would terminate their pregnancy, I just thought it was weird. I was just curious about it. And I really think about it in terms of this sort of long-term implication of what it does to both the mother and the father and the whole family system. And sort of to think about it this way, we have so much excitement, right, with these reveal videos, right? And there's all this excitement, I'm pregnant. And we also have this other side where people are terminating their pregnancies. And there's this weird sort of disparity between the joy that we celebrate on social media and then this practice. And that disparity for me didn't make any sense. So I just sort of stumbled into caring about this because I was just curious about why somebody would want to terminate their pregnancy.
And where has that curiosity led you? You've done a lot of research and writing on speaking on, who is affected by abortion, who has abortions, why the abortion rate is what it is. Tell us what you've learned on that.
Yeah, so for me, this question really led me to ask, what puts a woman in a position where she would want to make this decision? And I think for me, because I used to do a lot of youth work and youth ministry, and pretty early on I learned that abortion wasn't really a sort of a teen issue, that most abortions are performed on women in their 20s and 30s. And I thought, okay, well then this is something else. And then when I started digging down in the research even more, I discovered there's a massive disparity on race with respect to abortion. About 40% of all abortions in this country are performed on Black women. If you look across the Southeast, for example, in the state of Mississippi, and this has been sustained for over a decade, about 78% of all abortions are performed on Black women.
78% in the Southeast.
In the state of Mississippi.
In the state of Mississippi.
In the state of Georgia, it's 65%. So I started to ask questions. Why is it that there was sort of this predominance of abortions performed on Black women? For a number of years in New York City, it was around 60% of all abortions in New York City were performed on Black women. And I just started to raise all sorts of questions. So I taught a class once where I taught on the history of white poverty in America. And I stumbled upon this movement called Eugenics. And when I began to research further about eugenics, I discovered that the eugenics movement hit New York City, and Margaret Sanger was a chief advocate of placing the first abortion facilities in this country in Harlem. And that to me began to raise even more questions. It made me a bit suspicious because during slavery, slaves would kill often the infants of Black women. And sometimes, this is really gruesome.
The slave masters.
The slave masters would actually kill infants. And sometimes, even really gruesomely, they would slice a pregnant woman's belly open and kill the baby. And so in the Black community, from slavery through Jim Crow, there's always been this emphasis on the community protecting the mother, protecting the baby. And then fast forward, we get to the 1920s and 30s, and there's this eugenics movement where now there's an emphasis that was really advanced by these elites at Harvard and Columbia and places like this. Well, now we need to help out the race by exterminating the low performers. And it was interesting to me, really sad to me, kind of made me angry that the target of that was framed as compassion, framed as helping the country, but the target was Black women in Harlem. And that's when I really got animated about this topic, because I saw the racial disparity with respect to whom abortion is performed. And then once I saw that, it was game on for me.
So some people, defend Margaret Sanger, and they say, oh, she was just a product of her time. Everyone was basically racist, so it wasn't such a big deal that she was. Okay, well, when you're founding your organization to target a certain community because of their color, isn't that de facto racism right there, and to harm them ultimately. But others would say, well, she also wasn't for abortion per se. She was for, family planning. So those first clinics she set up, they weren't abortion clinics. They were, for sterilization and contraception. Does that make it better for you, or what is your take on that, on her early focus? Planned Parenthood today is abortion, but the early focus was, let's limit this population or control this population using birth control and sterilization.
That's a fantastic question. I would respond this way. It was still wrong, even if it was sterilization and birth control for the purpose of removing people that they dehumanize and put in a separate class. That's still immoral. So what do? We, in that movement in this country, and by the way, they recruited religious leaders to also promote this in synagogues and churches, especially in the New York City area, and categorize a group of people as not worthy of life. And then they assign them a death sentence. And what's interesting is that they forcibly sterilized, and this is when it began, white women all across this country, particularly on the East Coast between Maine down to Georgia, as far west as New Orleans, as far north as Chicago. During the Eugenics movement, if you were a white couple, you had to be assessed for your mental capacity. And if you were deemed a feeble-minded woman, they would forcibly sterilize you. It sort of introduced a whole spat of litigation. And once it was sort of established amongst the white lower class, it elevated and escalated to the Black community, and that's where we begin to see it. So that argument that they were sort of people of their time, that they were really thinking about what was best for the country, that it really wasn't something that they were intending to do for the purpose of being racist necessarily. I'm saying it's actually worse, because they created a class of humans and then they removed their humanity from them. And then they decided that we should just get rid of, on the one hand, the capacity for women to have children. And on the other hand, if they were to get pregnant, we needed to figure out a way to terminate their pregnancies.
So you gave that extremely insane statistic earlier. Over 70% of women in Mississippi who have abortions are Black. What's going on? What are the reasons that this is such a crisis, in the Black community? And I think there's people on the pro-abortion side who say, well, Black women need access to abortion, and it's racist to ban abortion because all of these women having abortions, they need them. And so you're actually hurting the Black community to not let them have abortions. What's your take on why this is happening, and also your response to that pro-abortion argument?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two main issues. One is the decline of marriage. And so we have to really think about it in context. I mean, there are, of course, factually, we have Black women who are single and they are living in economic insecurity and relational insecurity, and sometimes employment insecurity and housing insecurity. So the thought of having a child with that much insecurity does raise some anxiety. And so part of the argument is, well, we need to reduce the anxiety and the struggle for these women by allowing them to abort their children. And that's a reality. I mean, there is a lot of economic and housing and employment insecurity. The solution, though, isn't aborting the child. So that's sort of one issue, is the decline of marriage. I think secondarily, we have to ask some questions about, we have this history of racializing and recategorizing people we don't want. to reproduce, because we'll see them as a drain on the system, a drain on society, right? And that's been a long history in this country where we have determined that the lower classes really should be controlled. The poor should be controlled. And so this also, to me, makes me a bit worried, because it also speaks to how we treat people that aren't as fortunate as the decision makers. The decision makers are all in the middle class and up. The ones who bear the brunt of these services are often in the working lower classes. And we tend to treat them differently when it comes to issues like this. So I'm suspicious. I'm really suspicious about the orientation toward this emphasis on, well, it's for the Black women and for their community. But I'm like, well, why are you so interested in the extermination of their pregnancies and not coming up with better solutions to deal with these other issues? For example, the issues of the insecurities that I mentioned earlier.
Playing devil's advocate based on their talking points, then they go to, well, we are the ones, working to improve, better healthcare access. So that would be, some people advocating for abortion say, well, we're doing for abortion, but we're also advocating for these other things. Do you agree with that, or what's your take on that?
Well, I would say that they are, but are they doing it well? And I would really raise this question: are they doing it in order to encourage the mother to keep her child, so that she would see that there is all sorts of wonderful opportunities, the joy that comes with being a mother? Are they working to form families, to firm families, to establish connections, to relieve some of those anxieties? Or are they just simply making poverty and struggle comfortable? Are they elevating women out of these situations, thinking long term about the implications of some of these struggles and helping them get out of those things so that they can actually provide for their children? Or are they just simply throwing them cash assistance, hoping that maybe that will allow them to at least make it in the short term? But I think about long-term solutions, long-term goals when it comes to these things. And just because a program exists, it doesn't mean it's effective, it doesn't mean it's good, and it doesn't mean that it helps long-term. The best situation, of course, for a woman to be in is in the context of marriage, where she's married to a man who loves her and loves her children and wants to provide financially and spiritually and emotionally for her and her children. That's the context where women thrive as mothers. And I'm not certain, actually I am certain, I'll rephrase, that a lot of those programs aren't moving toward that as a goal. In some cases, we've seen this historically, those programs are offering themselves as a substitute, as a surrogate husband or a surrogate breadwinner for a woman. And that really won't encourage a woman, especially if she's struggling with economic insecurity, housing security, et cetera, to be encouraged about the possibility of bringing a life into this world. So we have to do a better job, I think, of addressing some of those issues in light of some of these disparities.
So what is that better job? I mean, those that on the left typically go to, let's use public policy to solve this, And it's not perfect, but at least it's doing something. At least there's food on the table, there's a house, a roof over their head. And, I can see that's a very persuasive argument if there seems to be no other safety net, for the insecurities that especially Black women in this case are facing. And one of the reasons that they're seeking abortion when they're pregnant is they're in that experience of insecurity that you described earlier. So what is our solution, and what can we as the pro-life movement do to help women, especially Black women who are being targeted by abortion, so that more can not just choose life, but get out of the insecurity cycles they're in and be able to thrive and be able to be the mothers that they have the potential to be?
That's a great question. I think the pro-life movement, as it matures and grows and moves forward, needs to expand some of its pro-life destinations for women. So we have a lot of institutions and organizations that will help women through pregnancy, right? We have some that will...
Pregnancy resource centers, several thousand of them that don't get any press, but they're in almost every community offering free pregnancy support and some, when the child is very young, some support for the child and the mother when the child's very young.
Right. So we have these fantastic programs for women during pregnancy, maybe the first couple of years or so after a child is born. But we need to think, I think, more broadly about the sorts of help that women need. So I would say, insofar as we have crisis pregnancy centers, which do amazing jobs, we also need to think about, in the pro-life movement, what sorts of job training programs can we also create as a pro-life platform issue? What sorts of programs can we create to give women sustainable housing? Because here's what's true. You can't get a good job unless you have a great, sustainable, solid address. If there's housing insecurity, she can't get a job. And she needs a better job than working in the service industry. She needs a real job. She needs some support, and where there's real opportunities for advancement and promotion, right? So I think part of the pro-life platform needs to expand also to think about the policy implications that inform how economic opportunities are made available, how education, not just access, but quality education, is also an opportunity given to women to better their intellectual and knowledge capacities and skill sets, but also these issues related to housing, et cetera. So to be pro-life, I think, also includes caring about their housing and their employment and their education and their relationships as well. And I think as we expand those areas and sort of bring those into the pro-life movement is sort of more holistic in terms of its caricature. And it will eliminate this critique, well, you all are just pro-birth. It's like, no, we're not. We're not pro-birth, because listen, we also have an education program, we have a housing program, we have a job employment and placement program as well. We're trying to help these women holistically and their children over the long haul. What we want to do is also get them in a network of relationships that we can hand them off so that these sorts of programs can be sustainable and effective in the long term.
So it sounds like you're saying the solution to this, you've been critical of a lot of government programs. The solution is basically private programs, maybe they're national not-for-profits or local not-for-profits, but basically those that care to come together and fill in all those gaps and address those insecurities head on.
Absolutely. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for people to practice the love of their neighbor. It's sacrificial. It's going to create some tensions. It's hard, but what would it look like?
What do you mean by that, by the way? What tensions? What do you think is hard about it, and what are those tensions?
Yeah, I think in this country we primarily live for comfort and ease. And if you really want to care about life, it's going to make your life uncomfortable. And so you have to be willing to invite discomfort into your life in order to love your neighbor, in order to care for the unborn. You can't care for the unborn and also pursue the idols of comfort and ease and materialism. We have to be people of charity, caritas, right? So one of the things that I've always sort of dreamed of, my imagination goes to this place regularly, what would it look like for all of these couples who are empty nesters across this country to open their homes to women who are struggling with this decision and need some economic and housing support, to actually bring them into your empty nest house?
So you're talking about pregnant single mothers or single mothers of young children? Because many women who have abortions are single mothers. They already have a young child. They're at a very high risk for abortion.
Absolutely. I'm also talking about women who are in domestic abuse situations as well. Right? So women who are struggling, whether they are single moms, whether they're single, no kids, this is the first time, or if they're in a situation where they're with a man who's abusive and not safe, to provide space for safety and peace and care and love. Because one of the things that we know in the data is that a mom's mental health affects the mental health outcomes of her child. And so we can really protect a mother's mental health to bring her child not just a full term, but also into this world. And what would it be like if we had empty nesters, churches, who are willing to take women in their own communities and care for them and help them get on their feet and protect these lives and put both the mom and the children in context where they can flourish. Churches have capacity. This is a wealthy country. We have the capacity to do. There are empty bedrooms all over this country right now. And what will this require? It will require some sacrifice. One of the things I often argue is that maybe so many of these couples who were snowbirds, you have to give that up.
That retirement dream of just footloose and fancy free, I raise my kids, so now I'm gonna peace out a little bit. You're saying instead maybe there's a next chapter of a new kind of service.
It's a wonderful opportunity for service that could set a family up for flourishing and thriving for multiple generations.
Wow.
We're talking about hundreds of people in generations to come because you decided to bring a mother into your home with her children, or even a couple, a young couple. Bring the whole couple in and their children into your home. You can sort of think about it as sort of surrogate family members, right? And it's not permanent, it's short term, and you can have all sorts of rules and stipulations. But those are the sorts of creative things that we need to do to expand this so that it's not, well, we just need to send them on public assistance and welfare programs and let them do it. Well, I think the faith community and any community who cares about life should open their doors, open their homes to hospitality. I mean, hospitality is probably one of the secret weapons in this entire discussion. Context for people to be loved and cared for.
It's such a good point. I'm thinking of a woman, a supporter of Live Action, actually, extremely generous, has raised her children. She's actually a recent widow, but she takes in. And even when she was, her husband was with us, like they would take in all kinds of people, but it's particularly with a soft spot for the pregnant single mom or the single mom with the young child, to be that soft landing space for them, to help collaborate with them, to help them get on their feet. But I haven't heard of an organization devoted to that, to helping educate people on how to do it, encourage them to do it, help equip them to do it. It's a phenomenal idea. I think in the pro-life movement, we've made a lot of progress in adoption and foster care. There's still more progress to be made, but there's a lot of pro-life families and pro-life couples who are active in those spaces and organizations supporting that work. But it's the question of, what about that single mom? What about that newly pregnant mom? How do we help her? And the community coming alongside her in a very tangible, personal way seems to be would be the best thing for her.
Absolutely. One of the illustrations that's often used is when you're flying in an airplane and they give those instructions in the beginning about the oxygen mask for the adults to put their mask on first and then put the mask on the child. I think sometimes we're so focused on the children that we forget about the mother and the adults. And essentially, we could think about it this way. If the mom is in a place where she can thrive and and live well, she's going to be much more open and willing to make a good decision about her child. So if we set mothers up for success, I think we can really do a lot of great work in reducing and eliminating the reality of abortion.
You've done a lot of great work too on fatherlessness, studying it, speaking, writing about it, which is really the primary missing person, in that single mother story is that man, the father of her child, who's no longer there for multiple reasons, but often abandonment. What's your message, or what would you say is the solution to getting more men equipped, maybe it is the word, encouraged to stand by the mother of their children and make it work and be there to support her and support their family? So
we need to put young men, or men in general, in positions where they see fatherhood as an aspiration and something to look forward to, as a joy, not as a liability. And of course, the best place to do that is in the context of marriage. So because marriage is broken down, that next step is that fatherhood as an aspiration is also broken down as well. So insofar, and we see this in lots of low-income communities across the country, is that marriage is on the decline. And when you have marriage on a decline, it's hard to give men an imagination for their role as fathers. So speaking to young men to encourage them, to affirm their fatherly aspirations, to put them in positions where they look forward to being a dad, to equip them in terms of giving them resources, teaching them how to be a dad. One of the things that we know in the data is that a lot of men feel insecure about their capacity to father. And so sometimes they think, well, I can't do it, so they run away. It's in many cases a lot of cowardice. But what if you put these men in positions where they had confidence that, yeah, I can do this. I think I might make some mistakes, but I also have a coach. I have some older men who care about me and who are going to help me through this as well. So creating context for men to get continued education and training about how to be a good dad and to celebrate that. I think one of the things that needs to happen culturally is reestablishing those spaces where men would celebrate each other for having a child. You could think about old cartoons or old shows where a guy walks in a barbershop and he's like, I'm having a baby, and everyone's cheering and celebrating. They're passing around cigars and they're celebrating this, and they think it's the best thing in the world. We need to recapture, I think, some of that and help young men see that this is a net benefit to your life. This is going to make your life much, much better. And this is one way that you can make a massive contribution to the common good by raising really healthy, great children. I think maybe a lot of young men don't understand that we need them to be good fathers. We need their fatherly affections toward their children. They don't get encouraged that way. Often it's simply reduced to them and their financial contribution. But maybe we should also encourage men to think about the ways in which they contribute emotionally to children and psychologically and spiritually and educationally. I mean, all the things that dads do makes children better. And if we can encourage fathers to do more of that, we'll see a reduction in the types of pathology that we see, like in the juvenile system, with kids dropping out of college, the youth suicide rate will go down, drug abuse goes down, eating disorders goes down. All these things go down and are reduced when fathers are involved. So one of the things that I'll tell young men is like, listen, we need you. We need you to be good dads because you all have the potential to really save America.
So let's break that down for a second, because I think about, the kind of swath of men out there that, from the research and then just kind of anecdotes. And I think there are men who are like, yeah, I want to be a good husband and father. I'm going to get married. I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to work hard and bring in income. And then it's like, okay, now you want me to do some other stuff too? What is this other stuff that you want me to do too? And how do I navigate that when my job is asking all these things of me just so I can bring in this income? So, you had some really interesting research that you shared yesterday about how not so much the paycheck that he's bringing in, there needs to be enough for food on the table and a roof over the head, but not all the extras, but, having those necessities met, but the presence of the father and the engagement of the father can make dramatically different outcomes for kids, even if those kids are fed and housed. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, I think sometimes we think about the minimum and make that the goal. And perhaps we have not infused enough capacity in these dads to understand that they really can make a pretty massive difference in the life of a child. I think, for example, if you look at education outcomes, the father's presence in the home is much more likely to produce great grades. A father's presence in the home is also going to produce great mental health outcomes. A father's presence in the home with affection in his kids is also going to introduce virtues like delayed gratification, which is critical for success in life. It's going to introduce empathy. The more engaged that children are with their fathers, the more empathetic they are.
What does that engagement look like? You mentioned affection. What does that practically look like?
Yeah, so one of the things that the data points out is that fathers who roughhouse with their children are actually helping their children's emotional health. It's just as simple as that.
Wrestling.
Just wrestling around with your kids. It is pretty easy. Tackle them, play with them. What the data shows is that dads who roughhouse with their kids are less likely to struggle with addictions.
Wow.
And so it's a way to set children up to understand boundaries and limitations, and especially delayed gratification. They love to play with dad. They will poke dad and try to, prod dad. I bet you can't catch me, sort of thing, right? And dad says, no, wait, I'll play with you later after you do your chores. After you do what your mom says, then we can play. That reinforces delayed gratification. And so later on, when they need to save money, when they need to do homework in college, right, something like that, they already have this embedded. And that is established just by the father's engagement and at home with the children.
But in that scenario, the dad has to be there long enough for that sequence to play out. Because there's like, I'll play with you later, and he's there to tell him I'll play with you later, and then the kid does the thing, and then, and then he's there later. So that, even just that example, it's so interesting that you shared, and that the data proves these kids are better off because of it, or shows that dad is present enough for that sequence to play out, meaning they're not just coming in, swooping in at bedtime to say, I love you, kiss you goodnight, but that there's some other activity that's taking place over time on a regular schedule to teach the child just by that interaction.
Absolutely. And what's really fascinating is that this has no class distinction. So this isn't like, well, middle class and upper class dads can just sort of swoop in and say goodbye and then go to bed. No, middle class and upper class dads need the same sort of presence as well. So all dads across the spectrum need to have this level of engagement with their children. What's really fascinating, if you look at adverse childhood experiences, which is a way that we score trauma for children, that data was done with middle class families. And one of the things that we noted in the data is that children that have these increased traumas and adverse experiences are much more likely to struggle as adults. And so much of that is dissipated by real presence. I think in this country, because we have turned life into a journey of self-fulfillment that is marked by career and materialism, we've sort of lost the idea or the reality that real fulfillment is relational and investing in someone else. And I think sometimes parents get caught up in providing the structure without providing the connection. And that connection piece is really important. So I think if we can encourage dads to connect with your children, and to do that in a context where there's fun and joy and discipline, et cetera, and that you have a role to play as a consequence in changing the world by producing a fantastic child, I think we might have different outcomes in the future. Mm-hmm.
So earlier you were talking about these young men who are struggling, and we need to find ways to mentor them and give them a vision of fatherhood and encourage them, set them up for success as fathers. How do we practically do that? What would be you had a great idea earlier of let's create this sort of movement of families taking in the single mother, know? Mm-hmm. Okay, what does it look like to practically help those young men who might have children already? They're not in the home with those children, they're not in a relationship with the mother, or it's a frayed relationship, to prepare them to take on the responsibilities of being a good father and husband?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because I think for so much of this, we forget that men are trying to figure out, how am I going to do this? And to actually think about it this way, what can we do to set men up so that they can say, you know what, I can do this. I got this, right? Now, that includes something really important that I talk about a lot, which is having a really good job. And I don't mean like a part-time job at a store, a convenience store. I mean a job that actually builds his self-confidence, builds his skill set, and builds his capacity as a human, as a man, as a person, to do great things, and to set men up so that their confidence is high, that they can tackle all of the challenges of life, and to do that in a community of other men who can offer them support and encouragement. And that can happen in a lot of ways. But I think really setting them up for success economically, having them get really good jobs, be placed in a career path and a vocation that can give them confidence. They can care for women and their children, all of the kids that they have. That's one piece that I haven't really seen too much attention being paid to.
For example, college, more women graduate college today than men. there are, some very high powered jobs where there's literally, reverse discrimination where, they make sure to hire some women for spots that men could have taken, that men who were equally qualified, but the women get prioritization for that spot. So, you can blame maybe feminism for this. I mean, I think you can blame feminism for some of these things. And it's not to say women going to college is a bad thing. It's more, what about the men that are not getting the same special attention for their education and their career goals, where today it's all about girl power, being a girl boss. And by the way, now they're like less available for their young children if they have young children, and that's a harder, curve for some of those women to figure out how to do this high-powered job now with these young kids. How do we fix that?
It starts with them as boys. I think sometimes we've now had at least a generation and a half of telling boys that being a man is bad. That actually it's toxic, and you really don't want to be a man because being a man is the source of all the problems in the world. And
that's feminism, would you say?
It's feminism. It's also a lot of other isms, right? I mean, it's not just feminism, but it's really this idea that men are not just worth much. They don't contribute much, and we don't really need them. I mean, one of the things that really got me angry in the mid to late 1970s in the welfare programs is they would actually tell Black women in low-income communities, you don't need a man. They would tell them this, right? And so if we are telling boys that you're not needed, they're going to act like they're not needed. They're going to act immature. They're going to fail to launch. They're going to fail to take responsibility. Why? Because we're not asking them to take responsibility. We're not calling them out. We're not saying that you're important, that you matter, that we actually need you. Women now comprise the majority of all bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctoral degrees.
It's so crazy to me because, again, education's good, but at large, the more educated you are, the more debt you take on, the more you got to work to pay off that debt. Your prime fertility years are in your 20s, your early 30s. That's your time when, you're best, most healthiest, able to have kids. Not that you can't have kids later. There's certainly exceptions to all these rules. But, we're kind of setting the system up for mass failures. Do you think we have, by encouraging the girls so much, de facto discouraged the boys? Is it an either or?
It's not really, I would say it's an either or. It's not that the boys are discouraged, they're just lost. They just don't know what their role is anymore because the culture has just told them, we don't really need you. In Washington State, a bipartisan commission was proposed to set up a commission in the state for men and boys to sort of allow the state legislature to come up with some public policies that would encourage men to do a few things. One, education success, and secondly, job success and employment.
How did that program do?
It failed. It failed. And this is why it failed. This is so ridiculous and stupid. The argument is, well, we can't, this is so stupid. We can't help these boys and men because men were preferenced in the past. And I'm thinking, what difference does that make? Why does past discrimination against women in the 1940s and 50s negate the fact that we have boys and men who are struggling right now? We need to help them right now.
So they just canceled the program?
The program didn't pass. It was proposed.
They didn't run the program.
They didn't run it, right?
So we have programs to get women into STEM. We have programs to empower young girls to go to college. We have these programs. What about the programs for young men?
Think about this. Boys are now a minority group in education.
Wow. So
college scholarships for men, grad school scholarships for men.
Do you think this is coming? Do you think people are going to wake up just to see all the poor outcomes that are happening for men in particular, and then just broken families, bad outcomes for kids because of it?
Yeah, it's really hard to say because there's so much resistance to the idea. The resistance is, well, if we do this, we'll support the patriarchy. Right, we'll sort of get back to a misogynistic society. I'm thinking, well, that's kind of silly, because what we have now is worse. We have about 9 million men who are currently not working. These are prime age men between the age of 24 and 54. And here's the thing, they're also not in trades. They're doing nothing. And so there's all these frustrations that women have. I can't find a good man. I believe you. They're no good men. I believe that. We're all the men. I totally believe that because they're just doing nothing. And so we need to actually create some programs across the spectrum from schools to government to in business to invite these men to re-engage and participate in society. They are checked out. It's called resignation. They've just resigned. There's a great psychiatrist by the name of Karen Ornay, and she talked about self-resignation. And that's what we're seeing today, that these men have simply resigned from society. They don't want to be dads. They've resigned from fatherhood. They've resigned from marriage. They've resigned from the workplace. They've resigned from education.
What are they doing?
Nothing.
Does that mean porn and video games, or just?
They're playing video games a lot, right? What's interesting is that they're entering into an alternative universe to be the type of man that our society won't call them to be or want to invite them to be. So they can be the hero in a video game. They can make a difference in a video game, right? And so it makes sense to me that they spend hours and hours and hours and hours in an alternative world, calls them out to be the kind of men that their own society and communities are not inviting them to be and to do. So we've really got to think creatively about ways to increase, particularly in education, to re-engage boys with the love of learning. And that might include all boys schools. For example, we need to reintroduce male teachers in those K to 8 years as well. I mean, most boys don't even encounter a male teacher until high school.
Why don't we have a movement of, well-formed people of faith who are on mission, who want to bring values back to this country and form the next generation, going into our public schools to teach? Why have we surrendered that ground? It's one thing to take your kids out, okay, sure. But why are we surrendering all of those teaching jobs to many people who don't just share our values, they're actively fighting our values?
Absolutely. I think not just public schools, but coaches, right? Coaching Little League. I mean, one of my best friends is a pastor, and he coaches soccer in his community. It's a great way to connect with the kids and the families, right? It's not a wealthy community, but he has connect with those kids, and he can form them in a different context and inspire them to continue in their education and encourage them to be good citizens in their community. So I think we need to be more creative about ways that we can actually roll up our sleeves and get involved physically, not just rhetorically with our keyboards, not just writing checks, but to really sacrificially get involved in service so that we can have positive outcomes on these issues. I think we have to do more personally and not rely almost exclusively on policy. Policy can get us to a certain point, but after a while, we're going to actually have to roll up our sleeves and open up our homes and get out of our houses and put our own phones down and remote controls down and stop taking so many vacations and love our neighbors really, really well. Leave our communities, get out of the car, talk to your next door neighbor, get involved in someone else's life, bring them into your life and bring in the messiness of it all. That's the way I think we're going to make real progress on this issue.
So well said and so needed. I'm sure lots of people listening are getting inspired, I hope, by what you're saying about ways that they can double down on engagement, because there's so much need out there. How can people follow your work and learn more about what you do?
You can put my name in Google and you'll find everything that I do. There's social media accounts and the various platforms where I publish, I have podcasts and things like that as well.
What's your podcast?
It's the Anthony Bradley Show.
That's great. When did you launch that?
I launched that about 2 years ago or so. It was during the pandemic. I needed something to do. Nice. I needed a platform. I needed to be talking about stuff like this. Nice. And so
fantastic.
I launched a podcast. It's a bunch of random topics, but I do talk a lot about the role of dads and mental health issues for men and things like that as well.
Awesome. We'll link that. Thank you, Anthony. Your work's so important, and I know this has given people a lot of great food for thought.
Thanks for having me.